University. Right. Okay. So just to say that it's been going since 1990, but it's changed, you could say, its spots or what it's focusing on as people have come and as people have left. And some of the key areas that we've been looking at in the past decade, I would say, would be issues around migration, around citizenship, around work, discrimination, inequality, feminism, gender. These are the kinds of issues. But as I say, we kind of shift around in our interests depending on what's going on in the world, of course, and also with the staff who are members of it. So without any more to-do, I'd like to very warmly welcome Necla Acik, who has joined us at the end of last year as a research fellow at Middlesex University to work primarily on the Gender Justice and Security Hub project, and particularly the migration and displacement stream. Now, Necla holds a PhD in social statistics from the University of Manchester, and previous to that, she'd studied in Germany, having done her master's and bachelor's degree there in Berlin. So she has over 10 years of research experience working in the field of migration, Kurdish gender studies, ethnic inequalities, participation, radicalization, and counterterrorism. And apart from the research, she has actually taught in criminology and sociology. So Necla has done pioneering work on the Kurdish women's movement in Turkey and has published several articles in Turkish, German, and English. She's the co-founder of the Kurdish Women's Studies Network, which has recently come together again to organize a series of webinars on Kurdish gender studies, organized with scholars from Europe, Canada, and the US. And as I say, apart from the work that Necla is doing on the GCRF Hub on Migration and Displacement, she's also recently been part of a successful group that is on an Horizon 2020 project, which is focusing on youth engagement and polarization in Europe. So let's get on with it. And I'm thrilled to have Necla talking about this topic, because it's so important in the sense it's bringing together her own family history with the current work that she's doing on return migration, as she'll tell you more about. And so Necla will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have the floor or the Zoom open to questions and answers. So I pass it on to Necla.
Thank you, Eleanor. I'll start when yes. Can you do full screen?
Yeah, there you go.
So welcome everybody, and thank you, Eleanor, for the introduction. I will, just a second, sorry. So the idea of this seminar started from the research I'm currently doing, and it started during lockdown when we were still developing the interviews, research questions for a project. And it struck me that my grandfather was also a return migrant. So he, exactly 100 years ago, he had the same profile that we are interested today. And I had to write a blog to introduce our project, and I just couldn't let go of it that that I personally have a history, and I felt like a really strong desire to connect the both. So in this presentation, I will briefly talk about the project, because that's the reason I'm doing this, and then talk about autobiography as a method, which is also new to me. And then about my grandfather's emigration story, as far as I know. And then towards the end, what sense do I make out of it? How do I link it to my current research? And I would really welcome your contributions, because this is not like finished research you would usually have. This is like something, for me, it's autobiographical methodology to explore. So I'm quite new to it, and it'd be nice to get your feedback and your thoughts about it. So that's why I don't want to make it really long. And for this presentation, I've used images by Sean Tan from his book, The Arrival, which was published in 2006. It's a silent graphic novel, and he's in his blurb, he's dedicating his work to migrants, who refugees, displaced person who at the beginning of 19th and the 20th century left everything behind and went to the new world, to an unknown future with no family or friends, where everything is nameless and the future is unknown. So I came up in this book when I did research, starting exploring my grandfather's stories. And I'm sure you can resonate with it as well. Can we have the next slide? Cecilia? Okay, so this is our project's webpage. It's the Middlesex University's webpage. It's the overall hub is called Gender, Justice and Security. And it's funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is part of the UK government's Research Innovative Fund. And it's the government announced it in 2015 to support cutting-edge research that addresses challenges faced by developing countries. So there are around 32 projects in this, and at Middlesex, and I've put a big arrow there, the migration and displacement stream includes 4 projects, and I'm working mainly on one of those projects, which is project 3 on return, reintegration and political restructuring. So if you're interested about what we're doing and who our partners are, you can visit our webpage and then just scroll down to who's involved. So project 3, the return, reintegration and political restructuring, is led by Dr. Jan-Roch Kelesh, who's with us today from Middlesex University, and Dr. Musli Irwani from Lebanese French University in Erbil, Kurdistan. And we are carrying out research in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Kurdistan region of Iraq. What we do is, so the aim is to look at return migrants, and by return migrants, we define people who went abroad for at least a year and then came back or were sent back forcefully. So it could include labor migrants who go for contract base for a short time and come back. It includes refugees or failed asylum seekers who were returned, or even students or people who went for other reasons, family reunification. So it doesn't really matter the reason why they went. We want to know, once they came back, how did they reintegrate, what challenges do they face, and what support did they have from government. And we are particularly interested in gendered experiences as well. And in terms of methods, we are carrying out a survey, around 200 surveys in each country. And we're also carrying out qualitative semi-structured interviews, around 50 per country, as well as visual and virtual ethnography. So we are at the fieldwork stage at the moment. So we have partners in each country who collect the information for us. Okay, can we have the next slide? So now to the topic of autobiographical research in migration. As I said, I'm quite new to that, but biographical research methodology goes back to the Chicago School, especially to the work of 2 sociologists, William Isaac Thomas and Florian Zandnensky. They did some pioneering work on Polish immigrants and their families, looking at based on personal documents and narratives of immigrants and their families in Poland as well as in the United States. And and their work was published as a volume of 3 or 5, I think, in between 1918 and 1920. And with their work, they kind of developed biographical research as an innovative method in social science in order to explain complex migration-specific social phenomena as qualitatively new in terms of the originating and receiving society. So an autobiographical research is part of this more general biographical turn within social sciences, characterized by the emphasis of personal narratives of the authors. And in autobiographical research methodology, you can use empirical sources like life narratives, oral histories, documents, both officials as well as personal, like diaries, memoirs, epistles, videos, and so on. And then you bring these information together and carry out in-depth analysis to have a deeper understanding of the phenomena that you're examining. And my adaptation of autobiographical research methods has been rather coincidental. And in fact, I've been always reluctant to talk about my own experience as migrant when I did research about migration, because I never wanted to be the object of migration studies. I wanted to kind of be part of the scholars who do research about it. I didn't feel comfortable to share my experience. I always wanted to keep that out because, yeah. But over the years and doing research, I realized personal narratives or narratives are important, and it gives you just a deeper understanding of the issue. So, and then with my grandfather's story, I was so fascinated that I just couldn't, in this case, I just couldn't just leave it out. And for this research, in terms of the methods, what I've done is really what is typical for autobiographical research. And it's not autobiographical in that sense, or in a sense, it is my own autobiography because it's my grandfather, and it's my relationship to his story and how I have kind of dig that story out and made it bigger. And the way I framed the story is also influenced by my perspective, my understanding of migration. It's a very selective narrative, very selective reading of what his experience was like. I'm sure if we had the opportunities to interview him, he would probably present a very different picture of how I'm framing his experience. So next slide. So moving on to my grandfather's migration and return migration, just to give a bit of background. So he comes from a poor background. He couldn't read or write. And also the area where he lived is very rural, very detached from like the central Ottoman Empire. And it didn't change much even after the Turkish Republic was established in 1924, I think. So like in our village until the 80s, they didn't have electricity. And if kids wanted to go to school, they were sent to boarding schools or to bigger cities. That was the reason, for example, we moved from the village to the nearest city so kids could go to school. And then when I was 7, we moved to Germany to join my father, who had already gone to Germany as a guest worker in the 60s. So my grandfather was one of those landless peasants, and they were quite dependent on the local landlords, and they could be really ruthless. And when I asked my cousin about what was the reason he went, and he said his father wasn't alive anymore, and it was his mother and grandmother who were like leading the household. And he was saying that he just couldn't bear the abuses she suffered from the landlord, and that was the reason he decided to leave. It was, going to America, working there, and then coming back. That was his idea, to earn money and then buy land and then not be dependent on the landlords anymore. In terms of his ethnicity, obviously I'm Kurdish Alewi, so he's from the region that we know today is called Bingöl, around Bingöl, Erzurum, Dersim. And yeah, so I always knew, or it's very common in our family, the story of his migration, but it's really just reduced to really 2-3 sentences. He went to America, worked there, and then came back. He came back with a pot of land, a pot of gold, but he buried it somewhere. So basically the key message always was, yes, he had this experience, but nothing is left for us. And nobody really asked, probed further what really happened. And this is something I also see in my own migration, that from people who are back, they know, they're not very curious about how we live. And it's more relationship, our relation to them is more important than actually understanding how life for us is in migration. So for example, I didn't know, I always assumed we were the first immigrants who migrated to Germany, and it turned out my grandfather did, and he didn't do it on his own. It was quite a mass migration happening around that time. For example, Kemal Karpat, he's an Ottoman, a Turkish historiographer, a scholar, and he has done some great work, and he estimates that between 1860 and 1940, around 1.2 million subjects of Ottoman empires migrated to America, including Argentina and Brasilia. Most of them were from the Christian minorities like Armenians, Arab Christians, and so on, but also a big part of them were kind of Muslim population, non-Christian population from like Anatolia, Cyprus, and so on, Albania, and so on. But unlike the Christian population, most of the Muslims went on their own, not with families, and they also, 1/3 of them returned. So can we have the next slide? So it was really difficult to get and understand, to understand the conditions he went, because apart from oral history, we didn't really have much of it. And when it was actually me and my brothers who started looking into documents to try to find whether there were some registrations of him in New York where he arrived. And we found this one through the Heritage.Statues of Liberty online website. And it was also, again, difficult to find him, but luckily he has a very unusual name. So we kind of could find his name and then figure out the handwriting. It was difficult to read it. And through his place where place of birth, we could kind of identify him. So, and looking at this document gave me a lot of information about the time of his arrival, the place of his arrival, where he left from, although I still can't read where he sailed from, but the dates. And I can see from this document, for example, also that he was a steerage passenger, which is something I assumed. So I assumed he had no money. I was wondering how he went there, how he heard about this. And so the document kind of gives me some ideas about his age, although the age is not, he must have been 15, but here on the document it says 28. But knowing how we deal with date of birth and age in Turkey, then, it's probably, he just made it up, I guess. So I can imagine we didn't have surnames back then, so his surname doesn't also match with what we have today or what he was known by it. So I imagine him being on this journey, meeting, he left with 2 other people from his village, but he probably met along this journey other people that he became friends with, and it was a 2 or 3 weeks journey. And then there he was probably kind of briefed what he needed to tell by other migrants who had gone or had more information than him. And then in these documents, for example, you have to give an address when you arrive, and he has given some address, but we know that he didn't really know anybody. So I can imagine that he was probably, there was kind of network of people or maybe agencies that helped people like my grandfather to buy a ticket and briefed him what he needs to tell them, how he needs to make a journey. So in order to arrive, you needed to provide an address as well. And then something funny is I don't know anything. We only have one picture of him, so I don't know anything about his physical appearance. And they have measured his height. That was interesting to see. His eye colors. He apparently has a dark skin and is classified as brown. The other thing is his ethnicity. He's marked as Turkish, which I found strange because I know back then my grandfather, he didn't speak any Turkish. He wouldn't probably said Kurdish in that sense. He would have said his dialect he speaks, would have said I'm Kurmanj. And in terms of religion, I don't think he would have said I'm Muslim. He would have said his very specific religious group. So if you have asked him his identity, he would have probably said his the name of his tribe, and then the really specific religious, he's an Alawi, so he wouldn't have even said Alawis because that's a terminology that developed later. So, you know, you didn't have these big descriptions for identity, religion back then. It was all very localized. So I'm a bit surprised that they put Turkish and Muslim, but I think this was something kind of identities created throughout the journey and at arrival. And then they were physically examined, and some of the passengers were denied entry because they were not fit enough to make a living. So which kind of shows that they really recruited, they let immigrants in to work in the you know, new emerging industry. So can we move on to the next slide? So in terms of his life in America, it's even less what we know. So what we know is that he worked in factories, probably in the mining industry, for about four years. And then he was taken as a prisoner of war from 1914 to 1980 because he was a subject of the Ottoman Empire, which I find really strange because these were obviously labor migrants. And in cases of like my grandfather, I don't think he even had any documents. I don't think he ever interacted with any Ottoman officials because I know the area where he lived and where I kind of grew up as well. It was very detached from the Ottoman administrators, and it didn't change much, you know, until let's say the 40s, probably 50s. So people there have never seen really the presence of a state. So I find it really weird that they were taken as prisoners of war and seen as a threat. So he was employed, or he was forced to work as a woodcutter, and I've seen images of that after I looked for it. So it was a really dangerous job, and many people died. And and I've heard from other stories since I've kind of published this that they had relatives who went and never came back. So, you know, the number of people who died was quite big. And when he then, after he was released, my cousin told me, which I find really interesting, he said he came out and didn't know what to do. And then they went to the cinema to watch a film about what's happening in Turkey or back home in the Ottoman Empire. It was still the Ottoman Empire then. And there they learned about the news, what's happening, that they are fighting for, you know, that's the British and the French are trying to colonize it, and the Turkish administrators are trying to fight it off. And they were calling back on Ottoman citizens, Muslim ones, to come back and support the struggle. So, and then he went back, I guess, because my cousin told him he was really curious about his family. He hadn't heard anything from them. I heard from other stories that they were in touch with their families and sent money and were exchanging letters. But I think in the case of my grandfather, that wasn't the case at all. So there was no exchange, no information. He had no idea. And then once he came back, he was looking for his family in Malatya. So he already knew that nobody was back home. And then he found his two cousins in Malatya, which is like 200 kilometers away from his place of birth. And they told him that they have all died. Nobody was alive, not his grandmother, not his mother or his brothers. And later on, 10 years later, he found his sister by coincidence. So what happened to him then? He was taken in by my mother's family, my mother's father, who only had 3 daughters left, and then he kind of married one of their daughters, and they suggested together they went back to the area where they lived, but settled down in a new village. And with the money he had, they could buy a village. So he lived a good life for about 20 years, I think. And after that, there was earthquakes and flooding, and he lost everything. And I know my grandfather and his family as being really poor. And when and my grandfather's family always, my grandfather's children, he had 3 sons and 3 daughters. The daughters were married off quite early, including my mother, with the age of 12, 13 or earlier, I think, because my grandfather couldn't look after them. His wife had died as well from an illness. So I was struck by the fact that his children never migrated. Like my father's side, they all left. Everybody who had opportunities there, especially until the 80s. By the 80s, everybody had kind of left the village and went either to the big cities in Western Turkey or went to Germany as labor migrants, because life wasn't sustainable in the area they lived. And I was always surprised by why my cousins and my maternal uncles haven't migrated. And my cousin was explaining it by the fact, you know, maybe we were a bit passive, you know, we didn't take the initiative where we had opportunities, but we also just wanted to stay together. So I think it was quite a traumatic experience. His return, you know, the reason he went there was to support his family, and then he comes back and nothing of that family is really left. And the striking thing I find is that he makes this effort to support his family, and then nothing is left for the next generation. And then the information we have about him is that what was the point of his migration if we still lived in poverty? So the subsequent generations didn't really benefit from him going there, but it's because we only look at the kind of economic benefit it brings for the subsequent generation, but we didn't really focus, we don't really understand. And I think nobody of us really asked the question, how was his life there? You know, what did he suffer? So what I see after reconstructing like his life, I see a really young, idealized young man who leaves everything behind and lives through this difficult time, and then comes back and is quite traumatized. And I think I can imagine that his main aim, the most important thing for him, was not to become rich, but just to be together with his children. And I feel like he has kind of passed that on, that feeling we need to stay together, because the way my maternal uncles and their children, they have been really sticking to each other, and also quite caring towards my mother and my other aunties. You know, you could see that there was a strong bond. It's probably related to that experience. So that's his story. Can we go to the next slide? I've talked more than I wanted. In terms of reflections and conclusions, there are several things that strike me. So one thing was, it was really difficult to find information about him. It could be related to the socioeconomic background, the fact that he's an ethnic minority as well as religiously from a minority. So really marginalized groups, their lives is usually not, it's not easy to find something about them in archives. Like you would find lots of things about Kurdish intelligentsia in the 19th, 20th centuries, and well-known families, because they were, you know, they had records about themselves, they had pictures, you know, their stories are always told and visible, whereas people like my grandfathers, and there are really many of them, it's almost invisible. We don't know much about them. It's only through oral history and family history that we know something about them. Very little you can read and find you know, in academic debate, as well as like fictions, novels, and so on. The other thing is, it was, my family is usually my brothers, uncles, paternal side, they're always interested in where we came from and so on. They know the names of my grandparents' father's side, but my mother's side, and it's so, because it's my mother's side, I think it's kind of more detached. So that kind of brings up the question of gender for me, that as soon if it's like the maternal side, we don't know much about it. We don't really inquire about it. And that's something we see also in our research, that when we try to interview returnees and we ask them, what about your wife? And it's like, yeah, but she, you know, she just came along. So their histories, I see a gendered aspect in what we know about my grandfather's story. I see a gendered aspect that I also see in the research we're doing, that it's very easy to leave out the experiences of women. And then the other point that I found striking is, why is it's only my grandfather's generation, why is it that we don't know much about people like him? And it is of course also related to the history of Turkish Republic, you know, that they made a really sharp break with the past, trying to build a new modern Turkish ethnic state, where the focus was about, you know, looking ahead and trying not, although we recognize that it's quite a multicultural society, but we don't really go back and see what happened in 19th, 20th century. There were a lot of pogroms, you know, the Armenian genocide was back then, lots of people were displaced. So it is also a dark history, and I feel like we just want to leave it behind, and it's done on purpose not to look back. And then the fact that Turkish Republic kind of made a really sharp break with the past and didn't move to Latin alphabets and so on. So we don't also have the means, apart from historians, we don't really have the means to go back and read, you know, the newspapers or so on. It's not very accessible because it was all written in Arabic, the language and everything has changed. So that's on that level, personal. And in terms of linking it to my current research, after I've written this, I realized that the people we're working with that do the research on the grounds, that they are return migrants themselves. So I realized they actually, it's not just that they help us with the research, but they're also part of the phenomena we want to research. So that kind of brings up questions: how much can our research be autobiographical, and how much of that can we bring in, and how does it inform our research? And for me, it also shows that research has to be enriched with personal narratives. It's never sterile. We can never detach us from that, especially in migration studies. You know, beyond the concepts we're analyzing, there are tragic, deep, rich stories of people that are, and sometimes we are part of it, or our family is part of it. So in that sense, I find it a very useful method to, you know, to explore. So I think I'll just stop here. I talked much more than I wanted to.
Thank you very much, Necla. It was absolutely fascinating, and I did read the blog, but hearing you talking about it, it was just quite interesting what you said about personal and academic connection to the story of your grandfather. And I'm sure it took some emotional toll on you to research this and try to be as objective as possible, but also was your own family history. And personally, I'm quite interested in sort of what you were saying about your mother's side, and sort of the forgotten nature of her story and her lineage and heritage. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. So I think we will open the floor for questions now. And I know there's a lot of food for thought that was raised in these past minutes. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please ask away either in the chat or if you want to ask it verbally, please say so and I will open your mics. Oh, we have a Marlene. Yeah, there we go.
That's me. So yeah, I'll just go ahead, I guess. I thought it was fascinating. Thank you so much, Necla. It was really, really interesting to hear that story. And I have lots of sort of thoughts and questions in my mind, actually. But I guess maybe one thing that what you were talking about, what I thought was so interesting is how you described how this migration experience sort of reverberates over generations inside the family, and how it might have sort of influenced decisions to migrate or not on the part of your maternal uncles, as you were talking about. So I was wondering, it reminded me a little bit about of this literature about how trauma can be transmitted inside families in ways where trauma is not even sort of talked about. Where sometimes, sort of the children or grandchildren, they might not even be aware of the traumatic experience that their parents or grandparents might have lived through, but still is sort of transmitted in these embodied and effective ways that sort of transcend discourse and speech. And so I was wondering if you see some, like, if sort of the transmission inside your family of this kind of experience, if it's something that was really connected to sort of your grandfather speaking about this, or if you think it's also something that sort of has sort of shaped decisions, for instance, about migration in ways that are sort of, beyond discourse or speech. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on this, whether this sort of resonates with, because what he lived through sounds absolutely traumatic. So I was just wondering about that. And then also in relation to this gendered aspect, which I also thought was really, really interesting. I was wondering then, because from what I understood, if I understood correctly, your father then took the decision to migrate, right? And your mother came along, so I assume. But so I was wondering whether there was at some point some sort of hesitation about migration from her side that was brought somehow, into play, and then also maybe how that has affected you. I mean, you have also migrated, right? So, how has that sort of shaped your ideas about migration? So that was sort of my broader sort of this linkage to trauma and the ways in which this knowledge gets transmitted across the generations, which I thought was really, really fascinating. And I feel I'm not at all an expert in migration studies, but the little bit that I hear, it doesn't sound like there's a lot that connection is made very often in this kind of very traumatic experiences, and the way in which it influences migration choices. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I just had a second small, just sort of factual question. One thing that I was interested to hear more about, because you mentioned when your grandfather came back, he went to Malatya, and that all his village had been sort of destroyed and everyone had died except for two, was it cousins and his sister he later found. So, but I wasn't sure why. So what happened to the village? Like, why was all of it destroyed? Because they were because of the fact that they were Alawis, or so that was just sort of a factual question about sort of hearing more about what happened there.
Shall I just
thanks a lot.
quickly? Just very quickly. So basically it was the Russian invasion in this case. The Russians were invading, they came from the southeast, and then the population was just fleeing. But it was around the same time where there was Armenian deportation, so lots of people were displaced and there was hardly any food around, famine was there, and so it was around that time. And then people lost trace of each other and died and so on. So my father's side was similar, very similar as well. So it was quite common. So that's about that factual. The other thing about trauma, I mean, it was my interpretation. So I had to kind of talk and said, look, is that not quite traumatic? Look, because you tell me that my cousins were saying, well, or especially my brother was saying, well, I don't really care about what my grandfather did. It's has nothing to do with me. So I realized it's really, they don't think much about what is it migrants go through there's more this focus on, so what is in for us? So because he hasn't come back with anything big remaining for the others. There wasn't much interest in his, and also he wasn't my grandfather didn't have a dominant personality. He was quiet, he was content with his own life. He wasn't really a dominant person who tried to have a name or be influence others. And it was my own interpretation that this must be quite traumatic when I discussed with my cousin, and that's when these things came out. So, and it's more my own interpretation, and the way I'm trying to make sense is, why did they not migrate? And there was, my brothers were saying, oh, your cousins, they are just too passive. We told them so many times, there are so many ways you can make money from your livelihood, and but they never went into it. So I was kind of probing that more and trying to understand. And my cousin said, yes, probably it's because we really didn't want to let go of each other anymore. And with my mother left very early. She was 12, 13 when she was married off, because they were very poor, and my father's family took care of her. She grew up with my mother-in-law, which she calls mother. So she didn't really have much to say in what to do, where to migrate. But when my father left to Germany, he didn't even come to the village to say goodbye to my mother or his children, because he was worried his brother wouldn't let him go. So the father wasn't alive. So they didn't, they were all scared of letting the siblings go as well. But in my father's case, there was just no way of sustaining themselves in the village. So he kind of left. And for me personally, how it affected me, I told my mother, if I knew that your grandfather had gone such a long way, because when I moved out from home, it was such a drama in Germany in the 90s. And it was like the end of the world. And I said, if I knew, then, I could have shown you his story and referred to and say, look, not everybody who goes away disappears. They come back, they don't lose detachment they don't lose their identity or connections. And you do it for a purpose. You have some ideas, you believe in something, that's why you go, and you have to let that person go. So I would have used, if I knew about his story, I would have definitely used to my advantage, I would say. So.
Thank you. We have a question from Elia, or Helia, from Chile, saying, the invisible experience of fraternity women is interesting and mirrors my own research, her own research, on voluntary repatriation to Chile. Is this due to class more than gender, vice versa, or both?
Sorry, can you just...
So is it...
I see it now.
Yeah. So what's your thought on this, Necla?
In my case, I think it's both. So for me personally, because it's autobiographical, the fact that I don't know much about it is because I live away. My mother lived away from her family. It's very patriarchal, the society I am in, and so we never heard much about my mother's side because we never visited them. There was never enough time to be with the family of my mother's side. They never valued that. So in a sense, for me, it's gendered because I'm kind of trying to explore my mother's side, and I don't have much access. I'm sure my cousins know more once you live there. So for me, that's on that personal level, it is gendered, but also it is a strong class issue because they are just not, I recently picked up a book that looked at rebel land, I think. So it's really well-known journalist went to Kurdistan, to very local area, to explore the history at that time. And I was really struck by the fact that he didn't interview women or had no access to them. So he could only access people who came from well-known families, who were educated anyway. So I feel like so it is a strong class aspect because it's mainly people like my grandfather in educated rural areas who don't have access to kind of to the wider world to express their experiences. Nothing is written about it.
Yeah.
Answer
Can
your
I
question?
pick up? Yeah, can I pick up on something you said about cousin there? Because there's a question around how do you define the word cousin? That's a question from Kazal, because
It's
they're
really
trying
my,
to,
yeah, it's
yeah.
really my uncle's son's,
Okay.
and it's my maternal uncle's son. So they,
Okay. Thank you. I'll go back to Anastasia's question, saying, thank you for the intriguing reflections on your grandfather's journey and wider issues. I wonder if you can give us some information on the wider analytical links and implications with your project, the direction of theorization, and how these angles are helping you conceptualize return migration as a contemporary phenomenon versus a historical one. And maybe while you answer that question, there's also a question from Ayar who asks you to define return in the context of your research. So I think those two can go together. Stanley, also I have seen you. I'm just getting back to you.
I mean, I think it kind of brings together migration and development issues. And that was quite dominant early on in migration studies, where they looked at migrants and what is their contribution to the society once they go back. So migration and development, looking at these two things together was quite dominant in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, but it kind of was sidelined, and migration developed independently and development as well. But I feel like with return migration, these two theories are again kind of coming together, and the focus is on looking at return migrants and their contribution or their lives once they go back, and how it how they contribute to society. So it's not just economically, but also in terms of, there has been interest in remittances sent back. But I feel like since 2000, the focus is also on so-called social remittances, like the norms and ideas and innovations that migrants bring back, and how it shaped them, but also their communities and societies they live once they go back. So I think that's the kind of connection I make on a theoretical level, and it's something that we can further explore. It's definitely has shaped my interest in return migration, that's the kind of thing I would like to focus on social remittances. So what is the impact on the families and communities once they are back? How are they perceived? How do they perceive themselves, and not just seeing them as what contribution economically do they make to the country?
Amazing. Stanley, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you for this great talk. And I'm I'm excited to be in this space with so many folks here that are influencing my newest project on Kurdish diasporas in the US. And, with that in mind, I was just wondering, is there any way you could bring in ethnic studies and critical theories of race to think about this? Because one of the things that I found in my research is the ways in which these national categories impede the ways in which we can make certain people knowable and intelligible, right? The ways in which Ottoman passports were such a conflating practice that did not incorporate ethnic, religious, and ideas of racial difference within that category. So in the chat feature, I'm going to put a couple of books that will be really helpful for you to engage with, the history of the Greater Syrians and the ways in which Kurds were actually implicated in that, the more I dive into that work. And so with that, I was wondering, as they're moving through this space, your grandfather, what was the relationship between labor recruiters and Christian missionaries in this process of movement? So one of the folks that I got to know in the US, he has ties to people who came in the 1910s to work in the mines, but they were introduced by a Western, a U.S. woman who was also a Christian, on a Christian mission. So I was just wondering how that might connect.
Stanley, that's really great comment. Can I just not respond to it and just take it as a comment and then invite others to maybe contribute rather than me answering questions? Is that okay? I think I would really like to hear your comments and opinions as well. And, you know, it opens up so many different directions. There's just not enough space to cover it here.
Okay, wonderful.
Anyone? Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone does have comments, I do have one actually comment or invitation rather from Lana asking to connect more about the research project and how in current times there might be more back and forth migration rather than a complete break when migrating. And then one last question in the chat, but feel free to ask more, from Marianne. Saying thank you, and then that her interest is in applying biographical research methodology, and how researchers' flexibility works, and also how researchers' positionality influences the research. Is this kind of methodology more challenging for any researcher than other methodologies?
Does anybody want to respond to that? I can. Because it is something new to me as well. And I'm also interested in other people's experiences. For me, it's new. And as I said, I was always reluctant to go that route, but I feel like there's so much, especially people with my background who come from like low socioeconomic background, whose family come from low socioeconomic background. I feel like most of our experience is not really represented in such studies. So therefore, I feel like I'm kind of pushed into this route in a way to use that source I have. And the response I got from my relatives was really amazing, that they felt like I'm their voice. This is something, you know, they never could connect to my work. It was really detached, but through this work, I felt like they feel like I'm their voice. And I received so many messages when I put it on Facebook and when it was published in a Turkish Kurdish newspaper, so many feedback from people that were saying, yes, we have those stories as well. And it was always very emotional response. So that kind of shows to me that, you know, putting a face to research and a personal narrative invites more people to join in and share their stories and open up new possibilities to do and explore more. Yeah. And can I, but Lana's already left about it.
Yeah, she has.
It's circular and, you know, it's transnational, so it's not static. I'm sure Janusz can talk about it.
May I say something? Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah,
please.
I recently read a very interesting PhD study by a social anthropologist. She's Afghan herself, moved to Iran and returned to Afghanistan. And I will send you an email message. Please, she's very reflective and describes very well in her PhD thesis her positionality. And that was also my question in the chat, because I think one should distinguish between forced return and voluntary return, because I think there's quite a huge difference. The focus had been on return and development, but I think one should also focus on the impact of what does it mean if you're a forced returnee. And regarding Afghanistan, as this is part of your project, I think there's a lot of literature that has been dealing with this issue already. Also, we do not have biographic narratives in detail yet.
Yeah. I mean, we are in the middle of our research, and I know there's quite a lot of, you know, kind of forced returnees to Afghanistan. So it is being discussed in the literature, and we are quite early on in our field work. But from the couple of interviews I've done, I realize it's very different. There's more trauma attached to that really kind of return, people going, risking their lives. And in that sense, I felt like it was similar to my grandfather's story, you know, really dangerous journey. and then you come back and you, all the plans you have, what you think you will gain when you migrate, they kind of fall apart. So I see a much stronger trauma in those people who are kind of forced to come back. It's a very different story. But on the other hand, they are both returnees, and we are interested in looking at, you know, how it affects their life in a way. And there are similarities as well in terms of trying to reintegrate, you know, whether you choose it or whether, yeah, you have no other choice.
Right.
Do we have more comments? And Marlene, thank you for sharing that resource in the chat with us, and Stanley as well. Any more comments or questions from you, Necla? Any final words or invites to
I'm
further
just trying to read
communicate?
through the questions if I've missed something. Yeah, so Ayar Atta, does that answer your question as well about returnees? Yeah.
Oh, we have Stanley.
Yeah, well, and I think, you know, the work that you're doing is just so fascinating, and forces us to rethink these narratives of migration that both makes, you know, make coherent what the nation is, being it the U.S. or the ways in which the Ottoman Empire is then, you know, changing into what we know as Turkey. And, you know, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about your project is the time that it's taking place in the US, right? What is it about the early 1900s and the major shifts in both, you know, the end of the Civil War, going through the process of Reconstruction, and the demands and explosion of mining as a very viable field, right? There was such shortage in mining that mining at this point in US history becomes one of the most multiracial spaces of labor. And with that, you have such demands for a migrant workforce that had not taken place in the same scale, you know, except much earlier in US history. And so what you have are the Welsh being recruited. So there's such demand for Welsh miners. Then the bringing in of African-American miners into historically white spaces of mining. And then you have a growing Native American indigenous community being pulled into mining at the moment in which we have the Ottoman Empire having these large migration shifts. So it would be really interesting to see how your grandfather is folded into the narrative of race, right? That black and white does not work here. So what are the ways in which, like, the colonial, you know, epistemologies of race as white and non-white allow your grandfather certain types of mobility and certain limitations that are not available there that allowed him yet at this moment to have that job, but then to be, you know, to be held and imprisoned for that long, right? And those are the stories of imprisonment that never surface in this period of these labor migrations. And I think
it was so difficult to find anything about prisoners of war during the First World War. I just couldn't find anything about it.
Which is fascinating, right? Because it, oh, can I just make a point, Marlene? Is that okay? Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I think this is where it would be just important to look at the ways in which at that moment you have the very early formation of anti-immigration and anti, you know, folks who are seen as a threat to the US that emerge with the Chinese as the original threat in the US, and that shifts to include a much broader spectrum of non-whites, especially Italians in that period.
Yeah.
And I think from there, you'll then be able to see how maybe the experience of Kurds and folks from the Ottoman Empire might have actually been, and this I don't know, but the very basis and the foundation for putting in place Executive Order 9066, which was the internment of the Japanese during World War II. So there's something here that's so sophisticated that I've never, ever come across that you're doing. And so I hope we can stay in touch.
And I hope somebody picks up this and explores, you know, there's so much oral history still there, so many people that can be interviewed. So it is definitely an area that can be explored with further research. And you've put it really nicely, Stanley. So
I was just gonna quickly say that I posted this link to the series of episodes in the Ottoman History podcast, and there's actually, the first one is called Deporting Ottoman Americans. So I think that really links into directly what Stanley was just talking about. And also each episode has really usefully this bibliography and list of sources that go with it. So even though I'm not at all an expert, I really enjoyed listening to some of those episodes. And I think, yeah, that looks like it's a very good resource. And it addresses, I think, directly some of these questions of race and precisely sort of the formation of ethnic identity in the Ottoman Empire, and then how that intersects with sort of racial categories in the US, right? So it's absolutely fascinating. So just wanted to say, for people who want to look into the sources, it's a good resource.
Wonderful, thank you. So we are 5 minutes over time. I only have John Roche left who wanted to say something about the project. Would you?
Okay, Necla, thank you very much for this great presentation. In terms of the return migration, of course, it is difficult to describe migration. There are a lot of debate. Anastasia, you have done a lot of research on this with Russell King, and there is a growing body of return migration, the reasons, the motivation in terms of the calculated migration, and then people migrate to another country to earn some money, save and return to home, or people aim certain issues when they migrated, but when they disappointed, they return. Or we have the second generations who were born in the UK or in Europe and decided to return to their parental homeland because of the nostalgia, because of the cultural issues. But our project is particularly, we are looking on the people are returning to conflicted or post-conflict regions. We are looking at the reasons exactly why they, particularly young people, decided to return to Afghanistan, to Kurdistan, or to Sri Lanka, where there are still certain conflicts, there are ongoing conflicts. I think the most was what Necla said. We are trying to develop certain theories in terms of the getting theories from development studies, but also looking at the political participation of young people from Europe returning to their homeland, to their parental homeland, to participate in the rebuilding of their country. There is also a political dimension of this return. If we analyze the Kurdish young people return, we see there is such a strong nationalism, there is strong pro-independence of Kurdistan, but also we see this development amongst Sri Lankan young Tamils young people who have strong emancipation, articulation, and mobilization for the Tamil question in Sri Lanka. So that's just, I want to make a short, brief explanation regarding our project.
Thank you, John Roche. And I think I'll give the last word to Eleanor.
Yes, can I just thank everybody for attending and Necla for doing a fascinating presentation. But I also want to say what I think is fascinating here is the way that one migration connects up with another. So there's been a lot of discussion about Ottomans in the US, how the US has responded to migrants, but then linking that with what happened in Turkey, but then also in Necla's own family history of Germany. And I think that it's interesting to bring all those pieces together, because often those pieces are quite separate. And I think this is really, Necla, what you're trying to show in the project. But also you could go back to some literature, of course, of probably earlier than the 1990s. But there was a lot of discussion about cultures of migration. And here I think it's important, family histories and how that connects up with migration, knowledge of migration in a family, and how that actually impacts, somebody talked about impacts on an individual and different generations in wanting or not wanting to migrate. And I think that's also really interesting. But just last point, just to say to Stanley, I mean, most states did that. They simplified, and it'd be interesting just to see how they simplified it, how, you know, the categories that they use to categorize people. So often also, as we know in the US, they changed people's names because they couldn't pronounce. So you have a simplification of names, which a lot of people kept on with because they let the customs officer, the immigration officer, basically choose their new name. So I think there's all that kind of fascination about what went on in the States and what went on for those, you know, those who left the Ottoman Empire. So thanks again very much, I think, for a fascinating presentation, and I hope everybody stays in touch with each other so that you know everyone's doing.
All right, Necla, any goodbyes from you?
No, it has been brilliant. Thanks very much for your interest, and I enjoyed this session as well, and for all your feedbacks. I'll be following this up and checking you and your work. I've made some notes. Thank you.
Amazing.
Bye.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.